Okay, so let's start back up again. We have an hour now, so to hear thoughts from people who work on this. So we're going to start by having each of the panelists introduce themselves. I'm just going to go from this side to the end and give names and affiliations, and then I will let them introduce how they've worked with content moderation, and then seed some questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Sounds good? Cool. All right, so first of all is Sal Hagen. Sal is a researcher at the University of Amsterdam, where he has co-founded the Open Intelligence Lab and has been working extensively on 4chan. Kat Lowe has been here, but is a content moderation program lead at Medan, and is a visiting researcher at the University of California, Irvine, and specializes in online content moderation and harassment. And Nitin Tain is a software engineer at Google Jigsaw and has been working a lot on the efforts to build the Perspective API. And yeah, if we just start from, I guess, right to left with the introductions on how you've been working. Sure. Yep.
Yeah, I'm Saul. I'm a researcher and prospective PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. I am affiliated with a European project called Odysseus and the Digital Methods Initiatives. And within these, with some colleagues, we set up a research team called Open Intelligence Lab, or OI Lab. I don't like the name now, but we have to go with it. And we study online political subcultures, which often result in looking at weird memes and extremists online that are maybe not as much covered by research as platforms like Facebook or Twitter or Google. And myself, I have been focusing on, initially on Reddit, but thereafter more on a very infamous image board that has been around for a long time called 4chan. I'm not sure, I never know how many people actually know 4chan, but it has come more sort of in light again in recent years because of its alleged role as a zone for the far right or the alt-right, and even there was a barrage of lots of articles in 2016 how users on 4chan helped get Trump in the White House, allegedly. So I've been researching the space with qualitative and quantitative methods, so also using some computational linguistics, although I'm definitely a humanities person, so I just imported some of those methods. I'm making tools and analysis platforms to study this space as well, so if somebody's interested in data sets with horrible language, then also approach me because we have those. And that's it, I think.
Do I say something? Oh, okay. Hi, it's me again. Yeah, I'm a visiting researcher at University of California, Irvine, studying moderation, content moderation program lead at Medan, and the things that we're working on right now are engaging with policy at online social media platforms, but very specifically connecting it to the operational side of content moderation and seeing how policies translate into moderation enforcement through thinking just about the content moderation systems, but also how products factor into moderation or moderation products. So these very variable ways of doing moderation outside of just the framework that we often think about, which is like, is a content moderator going to leave something up or take something down? And so thinking about that whole ecosystem of moderation is sort of what I'm working on. Let's see what else. Yeah, and I think what other things that we're doing with this project are provocations of building data sets where we are creating this toy data set around, online harassment and thinking about bringing in these case studies of sort of these rich experiences of what the platforms do see and what they don't see, so that we can sort of think of data schemas that can be more reflective or differently reflective of experiences of harassment, but very importantly, reflecting on the choices that we're making around creating these schemas and understanding their implications and what we can do with those. And I think that's most of what I'm working on.
Hey everyone, I'm Nathan Thane. I'm a software engineer at Jigsaw, and I work on this tool called Perspective. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the distance. Perspective API. So Perspective is a tool that allows people to score online comments for a variety of attributes, including sort of abusive attributes like toxicity, threats, obscenity, etc. There's a whole long list. And it's being used for a lot of different applications, but it's being used by partners like the New York Times for things like content moderation. I work on the team on the research side, so me and a few others on the team work on trying to find ways to improve our model building and annotation process. We work on research ideas like how can we incorporate more of the complexity of this issue into our models, take into account context. How can we take into account fairness and bias issues with respect to our models and develop new attributes that can be useful. I do unfortunately have to give the normal caveat that every opinion I give here is just my own as an individual and a researcher, and that allows me to share my experiences with you and doesn't represent anything about what my organization may or not think. But yeah, I'm excited.
Cool, thank you. So there are a few places we can start, but I think maybe it would be best to start at the experiences of the content moderator and what we can do with technology to either aid them or how technology can exacerbate the issues that they face. So, on that light note, I guess starting perhaps with Jigsaw and the work there, because that was based in the work of content moderators, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about the processes that you went through and the discussions you had with the moderators to find out what their needs were and how they could be met, and perhaps put it into context or contextualize it with what the issues you've seen since have been.
Sure, yeah. Although I am excited to talk to the folks who have moderation experience on the panel. I myself am not a moderator, but when we started this project, I think about 4 to 5 years ago, we spent a lot of time talking to various stakeholders in the space, including content moderators, researchers, people who had been harassed, and people who were trolls and harassers themselves. And from the moderators, I think what we saw was that there was a disconnect with the growing amount of information and comments online, and this growing realization that abuse was going to be a problem that various platforms would have to deal with. And I mean, a few years ago, and probably still now, one of the approaches that platforms were using to deal with this issue was to shut down their comment moderation sections. So if they couldn't hire enough comment moderators to keep up with the challenges of moderating, they just wouldn't allow comments on their platforms. And a variety of news sites did this. Sites like the New York Times limited their comments on articles to a very small set. So I think only about 10% of the articles on the New York Times had comments enabled. And it was tough because for most platforms, moderators would have to look through tens or hundreds of comments an hour. It would be a very, very quick decision-making process. So in speaking with them and sort of realizing that there was a capacity constraint there, we looked for ways that technology could help enable more efficient moderation, and we designed a system that we thought could in a principled way, help improve the efficiency of these moderation platforms. And to some extent, I think we have helped. I mean, we've worked closely with, for example, the New York Times, and they've been able to extend their comments, I think, to all the articles on their platform now, with the comment moderators being able to use our system to more effectively handle the traffic. So there's a ton to talk about and a ton of different nuances and caveats that go with this, but I feel like, one of the issues that moderators face is this race between content creation and being able to help navigate the challenges of abuse online, and that's where our tool sits.
I'll still use this one. I think I guess there are a lot of ways that you can help content moderators. I don't know where to start. I think one thing is thinking about how the interfaces that content moderators work with can be assistive, and just in the sense of providing context in a way that is not traumatizing, in a way that they can operate fairly quickly, and where I think with content moderators there is this pressure for consistency and efficiency, and like whether they align with other moderators. So I think one is like allowing moderators some space for making different types of decisions and allowing for some of that variability where it can be reconciled and still functional within a content moderation system. And I think that's actually more about making the system better in addition to helping moderators have a more agency in their work besides having these sort of decision trees that they go down. But I don't know if, I feel like some moderators want that and some of them don't. So I think this is sort of across, like, you know, do we want moderation work to be more nuanced? And yeah, I think it's things like within the interface, helping them not just have assistive tools, but to be able to see the appropriate context. And I think platforms are working, or people at platforms are working very carefully on how to reshape interfaces to be more accessible and to give, so that moderators can have higher confidence in the decisions that they make.
You asked about the challenges of content moderators also, no? I'm also not myself a content moderator, but in researching these spaces, interestingly enough, I think a lot of theoretical problems that we face do also align with the questions of what is harmful, what is hate speech, what is abuse. And so one of these already was touched upon in a previous presentation, will be faced by moderators, but also by researchers, as sort of hate speech and extreme speech is an increasingly prominent issue in humanities and across other disciplines. And that's, I guess, the verge cases, right? So apparently okay expressions that might actually have a harmful intent. So what we've encountered a lot is memes. Of course, there's the great sort of meme war in 2016 that initiated this sort of mimetic political speech. And through that, we often struggle with sort of designating what is harmful intent or what is repetition. So we've developed this concept called mimetic antagonism, where we try to explain how imitating, how sort of making these bare assertions, how sort of aligning with certain kinds of speech creates this sort of othering force within certain internet communities that might then have to result in alienating certain groups and certain people. So this can be anti-Semitic or racial, whatnot. And since it's such a theoretical challenge, I wonder, or I'm also interested to hear more about how those verge cases can be tackled, maybe also by the help of APIs and other technologies.
Go for it.
Wait, so I have a question. So are you talking about moderation work or moderators? Or just with this question in general?
I'm talking about so the role of moderators, how to designate what is problematic or not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think something that's good for assisting moderators as well is detecting different kinds of ways that content can be traumatic. And so with things that they suspect are child exploitation material, which is deeply traumatic, knowing whether to, with that kind of material, you know, they slightly blur it, they make it gray scale, and they turn it upside down, right? And so, and then with certain types of identity, hate speech oriented things, especially if the person is of that identity, blurring out words of a certain type. So I think having a technology that can sort of identify like risks of certain types of content that might be abusive is really important for mitigating that trauma, but recognizing the different ways and the different ways things can be traumatic and the different kinds of solutions that they can employ to make it less traumatic.
Do you have something you want to say, or? Okay.
I mean, I really like this point that Sal raised about edge cases. I think that's something that we see all the time. If you've ever sort of, I haven't done moderation, but I have tried to create data sets around various types of attributes, and as a part of that process, you always go and hand annotate, thousands of comments yourself to make sure that the definitions you're using are operationalized and meaningful. And you see terrible and traumatic things, and you experience some of the psychological cost. But you also see a million different edge cases, no matter what taxonomy you're using. And I don't know if there is an agreed upon taxonomy of abuse, and we've been looking for some time. Nothing quite. You'll always find lots of comments that don't quite fit. And a moderator has a ton of different resources available that a computational system would not have. They have some model of how the world works. They have some context of the particular platform that they're working in. They have possibly some access to the history of the conversation, and they have knowledge possibly of the current vernacular of the time. And with all of those things, even for humans, it's quite hard to always categorize whether something should or should not be moderated. And so, yeah, I think I think this idea of these edge cases is an important idea that we have to constantly be struggling with and sort of push that edge further and further.
I'm actually kind of wondering for you personally, how do encounters with edge cases affect the ways that you operationalize categories or concepts?
So I think there's lots of different ways that edge cases affect the way that we operationalize categories. I think we sort of think of it in some sense as peeling an onion, or at least I think of it as peeling an onion, where you have sort of broad categories that people can often agree on. Things like obscenity, yes, there's still edge cases in obscenity and disagreement there, but you can get a much higher agreement, and one technical metric is inter-annotator agreement on your data sets when you're categorizing something like obscenity than when you're categorizing something that's much more nuanced, like hate speech, for example, can take lots of different forms, and a lot of the language is coded, and not all your annotators might understand the coded language. So it's harder. So yeah, in some sense, edge cases allow us to. One way that we deal with edge cases is to think about further layers of the onion that we want to incorporate as we go forward. And another way is that we try and create test sets around edge cases so that we try and identify a phenomenon that we're not currently capturing, but that we want to continually evaluate ourselves on, so that as we go forward, we can see if we can improve on those areas.
So if people have questions, I think it's a good idea to just line up at the mic and try to blend it in naturally with the discussion. Oh.
I can't see any of you, but my name's Kavitha. I'm from Accenture. Your discussion around edge cases is really interesting. I was wondering if you could give us a couple of examples of edge cases, maybe in hate speech or something.
One sort of meme-ish form of extreme speech, hate speech, abuse, however you call it, it's called the triple parentheses. Maybe people know it. So there's those three brackets around a name, and that originated and is still often used as an anti-Semitic meme to say, hey, this person is Jewish, so as a way of targeting, basically. Different communities use it differently, but on Twitter, notably, actually Jewish people started reappropriating that to say, hey, I'm not afraid of this, I'm using it myself to say that I'm Jewish, right? So where this instance could be extremely abusive, literally, in one case, it can be be repurposed as a form of empowerment in the other. So I guess in that sense, another big topic here is context, how you deal with specific uses of this specific instance in different ways, and how do you take this context into account to designate it as either abuse or not. And I'm also wondering if you maybe, or how you deal with that, or if you deal with that.
I mean, what I think is also interesting for edge cases is not just like whether it fits into a category, but also like a judgment call. So I know, I mean, Facebook deals with these things all the time, but one issue is like when people post pictures of their naked children, like in the bathtub, some people do think it's obscene and inappropriate, and some people think it's totally fine. So in this case, it ends up being like a policy judgment or a kind of a stand that the platform has to take. That, you know, that they didn't realize that they had to do until they encountered this case. And so I think what's interesting is that you have two different types of edge case, well, maybe more than that, but there are two interesting types of edge cases of like, okay, does it fit in this category? But, you know, at what point, and I'm sure they overlap, it's like at what point do you have to actually think about whether it's that, does it fit your, is it that the way you operationalize it fits your policy, or is it that you realize that your policy is wrong in your efforts to operationalize it?
Yeah, so I really love that example of the subjectivity. And I think that something that we quickly realized when we started was that these definitions were almost always going to be subjective and very context dependent. And so as someone who's moderated a forum, I mean, like Kat was talking about earlier, how the rules and regulations of that forum changed. And I think that's something that we saw with a lot of different forums where you start off with what you think are well agreed upon things, like, okay, we won't allow people to harass other people, but then when you really dig in, what does that look like? I mean, you can celebrate something so hard that it hurts someone else's, you know, like it's harmful to other people, like, you know, in sports situations or competitive situations where you are really, really for something. Often it can feel like you're against something else. And there it often is a judgment call about what is and what is not acceptable. Or if you're swearing in a way that's trying to empower others, is that obscenity? If you one thing we worked on was this idea of threatening language. And initially, one definition that we tried using was like, does this comment make you feel threatened? And we realized that there were lots of comments that didn't capture, which didn't make the reader feel threatened, because that's a super subjective experience. And what makes me feel threatened might be different from what makes you feel threatened. And that's something that we had to grapple with, as well as comments that targeted people that were not the subject, not the recipient of the comment, that might make other people feel threatened. So there's just a ton of gray, and any definition, you're going to run up against these kinds of edge cases.
Yeah, actually it reminds me of, I think there's a Pew report that kind of covers this with harassment, but like people sending in a lot of reports about, like either with platforms or even just sending it into a survey, they say like, I got harassed. And then when you get into the details of it, sometimes it's like, yeah, this person threatened me or something. But then some of them are like, this person called me racist. They're harassing me. And you're like, well, okay, so then what judgment are we going to say that calling somebody racist is necessarily harassment, or in what cases do we think that it's acceptable or not? Because in many cases you can call, if somebody's being racist, it's very acceptable to call them out as racist. And there might be cases where calling somebody racist can be used, maybe not for defamation, but in a way to discredit a person, in a way that can be construed as harassment. But again, yeah, then with the politics of the person who has to make those decisions very much comes into play, because you have to decide, like, is being a little bit more strict about actually categorizing, calling somebody racist as harassment, are you kind of censuring people who are marginalized, who need to call out racism? So, yeah, that's a tough one.
So, like, we've talked a lot about nuance, or like nuance seems to come up at a lot of different stages here. One of the things that I've been really interested in lately are the legal developments, both in the EU and in the US, where there's a greater onus on proactive and automated content moderation. Automated simply by virtue of you can't hire enough moderators on Facebook or on large platforms to proactively moderate things. So there's a need for some automation, but that, as has been covered here, would lose some of the context, which is vital. And like maybe there are ways that we could reintroduce context or structures we could use for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical of introducing the technological solutions there to add more technology to then actually add context or whatever. I think that it's really nice that this was also discussed in the earlier presentations. I think for me mostly it's a problem of global versus local moderation, right? So you already see that platforms that have to do big sweeps and delete data have the most problems with actual moderation, whereas that's not that there are no problems, but for instance Reddit, which is designed to be sort of more siloed into different communities, have that less, in my opinion. So, for instance, what we did in one project, we took videos posted, or links to YouTube posted on 4chan, which, if you followed them, we actually had a very interesting fringe perspective on what was going on YouTube, because there was a lot of Nazi propaganda videos. We did this before they deleted a lot of videos last month, so we saw that actually 50% of those were deleted. But including a historical archive of a Dutch organization that documented what happened in the Second World War in the Netherlands. Because what we also found, because you could actually retrieve the error messages that YouTube returned when you tried to retrieve the deleted videos, that most of those videos were deleted because the channels were just also purged. Not because the individual videos were problematic, but because apparently there were some markers of a specific channel that might have one video on that's then labeled that entire channel as problematic. So those will all be gone. And that, of course, then there was outrage about stuff being deleted. So this global way of moderation introduces so much problems. So I wonder if it's also sort of a design issue in many ways instead of a issue of detection.
I think a lot of risks happen with the relationship between enforcement and technology and regulation. And I think a big example is FOSTA SESTA, which is regulation around trying to regulate or prevent child trafficking on websites, but the ways in which they try to enforce, and so the context is that there's CDA 230 is a legislation that makes it so that platforms are kind of immune from content that's on their site or consequences from that. But then they made an exception for certain types of sexual content, and as a result of that, this type of legislation happened so quickly, and they made demands quickly enough that companies had to kind of scramble to make their infrastructure meet the demands of the legislation at the threat of fines. And you see a lot of similar things in Europe where there's a demand that I think they had to take down certain types of hate speech within 24 hours. And what happens as a result, though, is that then they have to be overreaching. And so in the case of FOSTA SESTA, a lot of sex workers were not able to post content on Backpage, and therefore they were actually thrown into a context in which they could not use a website that they used to vet people and to safely do sex work, and so murder rates for sex workers has risen. And so there's, and in the case of hate speech, I think the example that you're saying is in trying to capture all of hate speech, you end up rolling up, educational channels and commentary, and different things like that. So I think what's really tough is when legislation focuses on content with little regard to process or capacity or even transparency, which I think are probably better routes.
So whenever you're trying to build an automated system, usually there's some conversation about the trade-offs between the different types of errors that your system will make, false positives and false negatives and precision recall, whatever you want to call it. And I think, again, not a lawyer, but I think that when these regulations come into play, they often focus on one type of error more than the other, and so that incentivizes platforms to build systems that have very high recall, possibly, and trading off precision with respect to that recall. And especially given the time constraints that are often there, like you say, you get situations where platforms basically have to wipe out whole sections. I think, for example, in response to Fast Assesta, Craigslist got rid of its personals section. And that's, again, a decision that has high recall. They'll get rid of a lot of things that violate Fast Assesta, maybe at low precision, because they'll get rid of a lot of things that don't. And so, I think just understanding that there are trade-offs between these two things, and when you demand that one is put into place, or one values one higher than the other, you run into the risk of losing another, running into other types of errors.
Hi, I have a quick follow-up for that. It seems to me that the paradigm we have here, which is it's not good, delete it, or it's fine, keep it, is very binary. And given what you've said about the danger of false positives, what you've said about edge cases as well, can you imagine a world where there's a slightly different paradigm, or is that what we're working with? We either delete it or we keep it, and there's not really anything else to do?
I feel like I'm talking too much. Yeah, quarantining. So Twitter, for example, recently implemented so this is what I talk about when I say product moderation, product moderation, where Twitter, in response to people being angry that public figures or politicians were violating policy and not having things getting taken down, Twitter's response is kind of like they're taking themselves seriously as a public forum, and therefore if politicians are communicating with citizens through that forum, like, do they have a right to take things down? They've decided no. So they also recognize that there's radicalizing effects and harmful effects of that politician not, being moderated. So as a result, they instead have they have now a process where if they violated policy in a post, the post is kind of hidden. And you have to click on it. It is no longer showing up in feeds. You don't get notifications about it. And so there's a series of things that can mitigate whatever you think the harm is being caused. And I think that's a solution that many platforms are exploring right now. But because we don't necessarily have a lot of sense-making abilities to know if it's effective or not, I guess we're still trying to figure it out. But I think that's what the in-between of taking down or leaving up.
Yeah, that's, I think, quite a recent development of large platforms trying to meet both critiques of either, on one hand, people saying, well, you don't delete us enough, and the other, that like the free speech argument of I can't say what I want anymore. So on Reddit now you can they can quarantine subreddits that it's still there, but I think it doesn't appear in the overall newsfeed anymore, or in overall feed anymore. And for YouTube, for instance, the demonetization efforts where the videos, the channels are still online, but they can't earn any money from it anymore, or also recently that videos don't show up in recommendations anymore. Google notifying that this search results could return sort of harmful results, also having to click through. So I think for every platform that you can think of some in-between solution that they recently introduced, and I wonder if that's going to continue, and actually if it's effective or not. I have not actually read any research on that, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other panelists did a great job. I mean, there's a large design space of tools that we can use that aren't just the binary yes, no, remove, keep. Personally, at Perspective, we've been exploring tools for authorship. So at the time that someone writes a comment, how can we intervene to let them know that this might be something that is against the platform's policies, or for readership. So, the comments are staying online, but you as a reader get to decide the level of toxicity or whatever you'd like to be exposed to. I've seen research on things like for live comment forums, like posting times, making people who post things that are less acceptable, they have longer lags between the times they're allowed to post. So there's a huge design space, and we're really at the edge of it. Like, we're just starting to explore this design space, and there's a ton of room for research to understand the effectiveness of different interventions. Yeah, so there's a lot of work for, I think, everyone in the room, at least on this space amongst others.
So One of the questions we sent out to you yesterday was that the process of content moderation is inherently human and fallible, but the structures around content moderation do not allow for, the process of content moderation, like laws are human and fallible, but there's not structures around this that can allow for mitigation of this human and fallible component. So there's no recourse. If you have your content removed, there might not actually be an appeals, a process for appeals. So the question is, how could technology aid in this ecosystem of being able to give a response to your content being removed or moderated, however it is?
I think one thing is to help. So say with YouTube, there are partner managers. Are there people who coordinate with YouTubers when they say like they have DMCA claims where it's like their content is getting taken down because of a copyright issue or something? And the problem is that these people can only spend so much time with the YouTubers that they're working with. So I think I'm not really sure how this would work. It's really tough. I think is allowing for these like richer, more contextual conversations that community specialists or partner managers or whatever you call them, for them to have these conversations where maybe it's less, it consumes less of their time, but they're able to gather more of that context in a way so that they can work with more people, and therefore so people. Users or YouTubers or in this case, like don't have to go through necessarily just a form. So making sure that you have a touch point that is human, but making it possible so that it's like at least a little bit more scalable.
So yeah, I agree again. Perspective, we're at a point where these technologies are definitely fallible. One of our stances on our tool is that it shouldn't be used as an automated system. It should be used with a human in the loop, because you need that sort of human filter to help reduce the fallibility of the automated system. But I think your question was how can technology be used to address this problem? And I think one way that technology is enabling us to look at this is at least it helps us explore and investigate, right? Because now we have because of technology, I think we have this ability to gather large data sets of moderation decisions. We have lots of researchers who are interested and really trying, I think in the past few years, we've really seen an explosion in trying to understand the fallibility of these systems and the potential unfairnesses or biases that can arise. And so I think technology has enabled the creation of data sets for study, and that's always a good sign. And it's enabled researchers to really grapple with the problem technological systems are, in a sense, you have a lot of room to experiment to try and fix them and immediately see what kind of effect that would have. So that's good. You have room to just try things and see how that would improve the fairness or reduce the fallibility of these systems.
Yeah, I think there's many ways where indeed systems or sort of dashboards or portals could be thought of that actually show with some transparency the actually what is deleted, or not initially or repeat the same content, but make some sort of overview of what kinds of contents are deleted, and maybe then also showing its effectiveness. I realize that a lot of big tech companies are not doing this because it just asks for lots of controversies, but maybe that's a regulation thing that could actually work really well. So with this project that I was telling about earlier with those YouTube videos, we were lucky that we actually had this data set because it was totally by chance that we did it right the day before YouTube decided to delete a lot of videos. So then we could actually assess, hey, okay, so what's their policy? What's being deleted? Is this sort of justifiable or not? But that's quite hard work, we really have to sort of reverse engineer almost those platforms to get behind what's actually still on there, what's being deleted. But I think in the end, doing that and maybe having those companies also do that themselves could help in having a discussion, thinking about what human decisions work and work less well.
Hi, I'm Elwa from Université Laval and Two Hat Security. I was wondering what you thought about, we're talking about technology and failability and accountability. If we look at the new technologies that we're using right now in NLP, there's a lot of neural networks, there's a lot of black boxing, and it's hard when you get, let's say, an output. If you see this message and, let's say, prospective API scores it's at 95, and you don't necessarily know exactly why because it's a black box. How accountable should our systems be, and are we better to use to keep on using rules, to keep on using expert systems where it's easy to explain, or if we have systems that score stuff, like should we have rules and accountability? Is basically my question. And thank you.
So yeah, I think this idea of having explainable systems is a really good one. And it's not just something that academics are interested in. And I think a lot of, practitioners or clients are interested in having systems that don't just give them a score. And this is useful for all sorts of things. It's useful for, like you said, accountability, but it's also useful for things like the psychological cost. If you can take a huge text that possibly violates some term of a platform that should be moderated, being able to point to the exact section and why can reduce the psychological cost to moderators. So yeah, I think that we should aim to have our systems be more explainable, and we are working towards that. It's an exciting area of research in deep learning. There's a ton of work on both making the deep systems explain themselves and also sort of post hoc interrogation of how the deep systems are making the decisions that they make. So, you also asked whether or not we should go back to expert systems or rules-based systems, which are, by their definition, interpretable, or usually much more interpretable. I think there is at least at the state of the technology that we're at, it comes with a high cost to accuracy, precision, recall, whatever metrics you care about. It's very hard to make a rules-based system that performs at the same level as a deep system. So I'm personally more in favor of building deep systems that can be explained using whatever methods, path-integrated gradients or attention or whatever you'd like.
I think what's also important to do is in tandem think about how we can make, not adversarial, but systems that can audit, the other systems that we're making that appear less intelligible. In several ways too, right? Where we're trying to figure out what ground truth is. So, we can use these, like test data sets, but also thinking about ways to systematize like human feedback about how it affects their own experiences. I think that's actually really important, is like how can we make pushing back against algorithmic systems more accessible and more possible, because right now a lot of people just kind of have to accept what it is. And often you have to audit these systems by Googling a lot of different things and having to have not that many digital traces. So you have to do these like weird guerrilla efforts to try to audit these systems at all. So having an opportunity for more systematized auditing, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's a good point, auditing the systems, but I think apart from assessing what the systems do, it's also important to assess what we do with the systems, or what we do with the systems do, if that makes sense. Because it might give you a result, but it's never the solution, right? Like it's also, I've done some computational linguistics, and it's sometimes magical. You're like, oh, well, okay, I can find similar words to this, and I really want to sort of publish this and be done with it, but then you forget that this is one lens into this extremely complex world. So having this more theoretical thinking about not even what the systems do, but how we employ it, or how we sort of make those then legible or use them again, might be as important, in my opinion.
So just as a question there, I think it's also important to, something I'd want to hear your thoughts about, like who should we show the outputs of the auditing of the system? Like who should we show the explanations to? Could they be gamed by some people, and would we want to figure out some defense mechanisms? Not at all leading question.
Okay. I don't have a fully formed thought yet, but I think what's really important, I mean, thinking about the balance where you can express the logic of what a system is doing without exactly identifying the details. So I'm trying to think of like fuzzier versions of systems. So Reddit's strategy in thinking about their upvoting, downvoting system is that they used to show the ratios, but it turns out like SEO experts could like kind of figure out, I don't know, how to use, I'm trying to figure out what exactly it was. But they were like gaming the systems because they had all of the metrics to work out like upvoting and downvoting ratios. So what Reddit ended up doing was fuzzing the ratios. So you had the impression of what was going on, but you didn't have all of the mechanical details underlying it. I mean, I don't think it's actually good to completely obscure that too. So having like various kinds of gated access, like, you know, partnering with NGOs or organizations that can, or experts who can hold them accountable, and building like third-party organizations and interventions, I think is really key here.
I also do not have a fully formed thought, but I do know that, yes, like if you, like I was just making a plea before for sort of more transparency in these kinds of moderation policies, but indeed it will create a lot of backlash, will create a lot of discussion that these companies probably don't want to have. I really do wonder whether showing your exact steps in a moderation policy might mitigate some criticisms or conspiracies about, you know, what is allowed or not on a platform. So, I mean, for me it would, but like if I would have known why exactly this channel by Dutch Historical Archive was deleted, or what were the actual detection techniques used before, and whether it was done prior to human tagging or afterwards, would make me at least feel more comfortable, or more, you can sort of speak truth to those systems. But yeah, I wonder whether that actually would create a sort of more safe or calm environment than actually sort of unleashing a storm. I don't know if there's actual examples of that might have gone wrong. I guess some tech company must have tried that before, but it would be interesting to research.
I think there are some efforts also by various organizations. So I talked about partnering with third parties, right? Where the third parties, it's kind of like fact checkers, right? Where you have expert, trusted parties that have access to more of the details where it is not released to the public. And so I don't know if any one organization is trusted. So having collections or consortiums of organizations, I think, are really important. So, you know, they can not only hold the platform accountable, but in some ways they're implicitly holding each other accountable, and therefore are more trustable by the public to audit and keep these systems accountable. So I think that, like, organizationally, I think there are some solutions to thinking about this without releasing everything to the public, because it's certainly very gameable.
So to your point about people gaming the system, I did a lot of research early in my career on game theory, so I love the idea of people gaming the system. And one of the concepts in game theory that we worked on a little bit was this idea of incentive compatibility. So can you build a system which sort of doesn't allow people to benefit from trying to game it themselves? It's a very hard concept, and it's something that, has some trade-offs, but it would be great, I think, in principle, to have a system where you could explain things and have people try to game them, and still it turns out to make the system stronger. this anti-fragile idea. We, to some extent, allow this. At Perspective, we allow people to flag when they think our API is wrong. And this is inherently a gameable process, right? You can have brigades of people that come on and try and give our system misinformation, but that's great for us because we just human annotate everything afterwards anyway. So they're just giving us lots of really nice examples of areas where they think our system is making marginal decisions, and that just makes us stronger, you know, in many cases. So I like the idea of you know, in an intelligent way, trying to encourage this kind of interaction.
So I just want to jump back to something that Xerox said that nobody challenged, and he said you can't hire enough moderators for Facebook or for YouTube. And I'm curious if that's based upon some did anybody actually try that? I don't think they did. But more broadly, I was thinking about the unexpected costs associated with moderation, and that people have done a very bad job planning ahead for what they will have to do when they start a new forum. In particular, I was thinking about the New York Times editor, moderators all told us that the worst thing for them was the recipe section. It's so contentious and requires a lot of extra work that they didn't really expect it to. So I'm curious if people have thought about better preparing people when they start a new platform or a new forum. What's the moderation cost going to be in advance, if that's something that we can predict?
So the question is, how can we prepare moderators for set expectations? I think
Like, expectations in what way?
You have a responsibility. Like, the premise here is it's social responsibility.
If you're creating a social platform that's going to cause genocide, you should be expecting that in advance and not be surprised and apologize later. I guess that's the provocative version of my question.
There is such thing as like resilience. So from the emotional side, there is, resilience training and psychological first aid. So there, like people who do who are EMTs and do crisis work and who have like a similar sense of responsibility, perhaps not at that scale, but it's still a very immediate sense of responsibility in encounters with people's lives, like having people's lives in your hands. So I think there's other fields that actually have a lot of precedence there, and also disaster relief. There's a lot of portable lessons. I mean, I think in terms of like preparing them for the idea that if they make a wrong decision, a genocide will happen. I don't think any individual moderator will probably have that responsibility. I think what actually is the problem is people who work on trust and safety teams who are designing a lot of these systems where that is a realistic possibility. So you have things like the Workplace Wellness Project, I think. So there are various organizations that do go into these companies and it's not just having them train them, but actually having regular like therapy sessions and reflection sessions, which is also what nurses and doctors and therapists do to mitigate vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, like things that that affect you psychologically very significantly. So it's not even just preparing them, but it's also the ongoing engagements that help them maintain their health and cope with the scale of their decisions.
So just as a note for the other respondents, we have 3 minutes left, so final thoughts, in response to this.
So Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the parts of that question was, when you're building a new platform, how do you project in advance how much moderation need you'll have? And I think that is challenging because, it's kind of arrogant to think that you'll be super successful, and success is often a happy accident that platforms find themselves in. And our team has spoken to a lot of potential customers who find themselves in this happy accident where they have a project that they start, possibly a nonprofit. For example, I think one organization that's worked very closely with Google is the Trevor Project, which is a project around helping with mental health issues and LGBTQ plus youth. And I don't think they expected to grow as fast as they were going, as they ended up, and they needed this massive moderation resource that they didn't have. And so, in speaking with teams like that, we see that it's really a happy accident for the team, and then they need this moderation help, and tools like Perspective can help them bootstrap until they are able to resource up their moderation effort. I think it's really hard to predict in advance, though, how successful. I mean, it's the same problem that like a VC has in trying to bet on which companies will be successful. You don't know how much moderation you'll have because you don't know what your growth curve is going to look like. You might be able to project it, but it's really hard to know in advance, I think.
Yeah, your question makes I wonder. Don't know about this. Is there like moderator unions or maybe like initiatives to set up that? Because it does touch on that. I think a lot of problems with moderation is that for some companies it's an afterthought, or it's a matter of clicking ignore or delete. But yeah, I would love to. Maybe it's a good final thought. I'd love to see it as a sort of respectable job, and also where maybe unions can have support for each other, where you have an actual discussion about what to do and what not to do, about caveats, about psychological problems, because now it's such a unknown for many people, not just by accident, but also almost covered up by companies. So I don't know if there's any initiatives for that, but I would love to see that actually, because it could help with the preparation, but also ongoing managing of how to deal with these burdening images and text.
Okay, with that, sorry?
There's a response.
Okay. There's a response?
Okay. I think in response to that, I think that is a great idea. Unfortunately, one of the things making it difficult for moderators to unionize is that there's a lot of fear around violating NDAs and consequences for doing that. And it's hard for moderators to find each other. In fact, it's very hard for researchers to find content moderators, and that's the thing I keep encountering with other researchers. I do think there's some opportunity, like a Germany labor union, IG Metall, they've succeeded in organizing crowd workers, so like Mechanical Turk workers and various other platforms, and right now they're working on an initiative to unionize YouTubers to some extent. So I think drawing from some of these existing initiatives in digital labor could be promising.
Okay, and with that, let's thank our panelists.